There is a photograph from December 1st, 1963 at Speedway Park in Jacksonville, Florida. And when you find it, you need to look at it for a minute because it tells you just about everything you need to know about what this sport was in that era and what it was willing to do to protect itself. In the photograph, a man is standing in the winner's circle and the beauty queen is right next to him. And the trophy is there and the flash bulbs are going off. And it looks like every winner's circle photo you have ever seen from that period. It looks correct. His name was Buck Baker, and he had not won the race. The man who had won the race was in the pits watching. His name was Wendell Scott, and on that night on a cold Florida dirt track, he had just lapped the entire field and was standing there waiting while 2 hours of nothing happened and somebody else got his trophy. This is the story of what happened that night and the 58 years it took to make it right. To understand what Wendell Scott was walking into when he started racing, you need to understand where American stock car racing came from and what the world around it looked like. The National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing was formed in 1948 in Daytona Beach by a man named Bill France Sr., who had a gift for organization and a clear vision of what he wanted to build. He wanted a unified sport under one roof with one set of rules and one points system, and the ability to attract factory support from Detroit. He was going to build that sport in the American South because that is where the fans were and where the infrastructure, the tracks and the money and the culture already existed. The tracks in those early years were places like Darlington, South Carolina and North Wilkesboro, North Carolina and Martinsville, Virginia, and they were surrounded by the social structure of the Jim Crow South. This was not incidental to the story. Separate water fountains and separate restrooms and separate sections of the grandstand were the baseline reality of daily life in these places in 1950 and 1951 and 1952, and nobody in NASCAR's power structure was in any rush to change any of that. Bill France Sr. was a businessman first, and his customers expected a certain order to things, and he was not going to disturb that order without being forced. The drivers who built NASCAR in those years were a specific kind of man. They had grown up hard in the mountain hollows, in the Virginia Piedmont, and the Georgia clay. A lot of them had run moonshine before they ever saw a real racetrack. They had worked on cars since they could hold a wrench, and they had fought in Europe and the Pacific and come home broke and restless, and looking for something that could satisfy the particular hunger that 4 years of war puts in a young man. They were rough and raw, and some of them were genuinely mean. But what they understood above almost everything else was fast. They could tell whether a car was really working just by the sound it made going into the corner, and that instinct was the currency that mattered most in the world they inhabited. Into that world, Wendell Oliver Scott was born on August 29th, 1921 in Danville, Virginia. Danville sits right on the North Carolina line in the southernmost part of Virginia, and in 1921, it was a tobacco processing and cotton mill town, and it was as fully segregated as anywhere in the American South. Scott's father, William Ira Scott, worked as a driver and mechanic for two well-off white families in town, which meant that from the time Wendell was very small, he was around cars and engines and the mechanical logic of how they worked. His father taught him to work on cars the way other fathers taught their kids to fish, not from a book, but from feel and repetition and the satisfaction of a thing running right when it hadn't been before. Scott was competitive from early on. He remembered racing bicycles against white kids in the neighborhood, which in a town like Danville in the 1930s was not always a safe thing to do. He was the only black boy on the block with a bicycle, and he used it. He dropped out of high school, which was not unusual for boys of his class and era, and he went to work as a taxi driver and then started doing auto repair professionally out of his garage because he was good at it in that rare way where a man doesn't just know the mechanics but understands the machine. The war came and Scott served in a segregated unit in Europe as a soldier. Mechanic. The Wendell Scott Foundation describes him as a paratrooper and soldier mechanic, though different sources describe his role with some variation, and I couldn't find a single locked-down account. of exactly what unit he served with or where. What is consistent across all of them is that he came home from Europe with more mechanical knowledge than he left with, and the same restless need for speed that had been following him since those bicycle races in Danville. He came home and he married Mary Bell Coles, and they started a family that would grow to 7 children, Willie Ann and Wendell Jr., and Franklin, who everyone called Frank and Deborah and Cheryl and Sybil and Michael. He opened Scott's garage on the north side of Danville, and he was a good mechanic with a solid reputation in the black community there, but a good mechanic with a family and a mortgage doesn't always end up in a great financial position. And Scott had bills to pay and not quite enough money to pay them. So he did what a lot of young men in that part of Virginia and North Carolina did when they needed money and a little adventure at the same time. He ran moonshine. If you know anything about the origins of NASCAR, you already know that moonshine running and stock car racing are about as closely related as any two things can be. The men who built the sport, Junior Johnson, Red Byron, Roy Hall, a lot of them had hauled liquor before they ever entered an organized race. The skills were almost identical. You needed a fast car and the nerve to push it hard on bad roads in complete darkness, while staying ahead of whatever the county had in pursuit, and you needed to be able to fix it when it broke down, which was all the time. Wendell Scott was exceptional at all of it. He ran primarily between Danville and Charlotte in a 1946 Packard that he had tuned to embarrass whatever the local sheriff had in the garage that week. He called himself the greatest moonshine runner of them all, and based on the evidence, the county couldn't catch him. That wasn't an exaggeration. As he put it later, I was a race driver before I ever hit the track. He got caught once. In 1949, he was convicted and put on 3 years probation. He kept hauling. The probation didn't change the fact that he had a family and a mortgage, and the bills were not going to wait for his legal situation to clear up. A man with his skills and his need for income didn't have a lot of other options. In 1952, the Danville Fairgrounds Speedway was a struggling little track on the Dixie Circuit, and like a lot of tracks in that era, the people running it were always looking for something to put more people in the grandstands. What they came up with was the idea of putting a black driver in the field because they figured it would draw the local black community as paying customers and give the white crowd something to talk about. To find a black driver who could actually keep the car on the track, they asked the local police to point them to whoever was driving fastest on the county roads at night, and the police pointed them to the moonshiner they couldn't catch. Scott's first race at Danville Fairgrounds was May 23, 1952, and he finished third. That was all it took. Once I found out what it was like, he said later, racing was all I wanted to do. He was 30 years old and he had found the thing that was made for him. Getting a NASCAR Grand National license as a black driver in 1953 or 1954 accounts very slightly on exactly when his cup level license was granted. Was not a matter of paying a fee and walking through the front door, but it also was not technically illegal under NASCAR's written rules at that point. France had not written racial discrimination into the rulebook because he didn't have to. What he had created instead was a system where individual track promoters had enormous power over who got to race, and the track promoters in the South made their own choices about who was welcome. Scott pushed through that system and got his license and began competing. What that meant in practice was that he could show up to events. It did not mean he got into every event. Early on, he was denied entry at tracks in Winston-Salem and High Point, North Carolina, and turned away at the gate before he ever got to the infield. Darlington Raceway, one of the most important venues in the sport, banned him from their major events for years. The Rebel 400 and the Southern 500 both closed to him by track president Bob Colvin, who made his reasons clear enough without putting them in writing. The sanctioning body did not intervene. And then there was the money problem, which was really the entire problem, because without money, you can't race at all. Goodyear Tire extended credit and free tires to white independent drivers, and even to rookies just getting started. They did not extend those benefits to Wendell Scott. He ran recap tires, retreaded rubber, on a car that was already behind the competition in every other way. He would later say about his biggest win, "I got $150 for racing on Goodyear tires." But I really didn't have good years. I had recaps. No commercial sponsor would touch him. Not because of anything he did or didn't do behind the wheel, but because putting your company's name on a black driver's car in the southern market in 1956 or 1960 was something American corporations were not willing to do. It was a business calculation, and the calculation always came out the same way. He faced this wall from every direction, and he walked straight into it every single week. What Scott built in the face of all that deserves your full attention because it matters for everything that comes after. His car was number 34, baby blue, and it was almost always a hand-me-down. He bought cars that other teams had run hard and set aside, and he towed them back to Danville and pulled them apart in his own garage and rebuilt them with what he had available. His wife Mary drove the transport truck on the long hauls between Danville and wherever the race was that week. His sons, Wendell Jr. and Frank, built engines and worked in the pits. His daughters helped where they could. The entire family was the crew. There was no money for specialists or professional setup men or extra equipment of any kind. What they didn't have, they figured out how to do without. Compare that to the competitive teams, and the gap becomes almost absurd. Holman Moody was Ford's factory racing operation out of Charlotte, and by the middle of the 1960s, it employed roughly 300 people and had millions of dollars of factory money behind it. Fred Lorenzen, driving a Holman Moody Ford, earned more than $122,000 in prize money in 1963 alone. Wendell Scott earned somewhere around $180,000 over his entire career, more than a decade of Grand National racing. And that's the gross number before expenses. He was not operating at the back of the pack because he couldn't drive. He was operating at the back of the pack because the resources required to run at the front were systematically withheld from him. And he was doing extraordinary things with whatever was left over. He also carried a loaded .38 revolver to southern racetracks because the alternative was going there without one. At Spartanburg and Darlington and Talladega and Jacksonville and Daytona, he received death threats serious enough that going unarmed felt reckless. At drivers' meetings, officials addressed every other driver as Mr., while calling Scott only by his first name. A driver named Bob Wellborn called him a slur to his face, and it nearly came to blows. At Dover, he was reportedly poisoned with a spiked drink, though that account is not corroborated independently, so I want to flag it as a claim rather than a confirmed fact. He would sometimes pose as hostile toward his own sons at roadside stops when they were traveling to make it safer for them to be served inside. This was the texture of his daily life in the sport. He absorbed it and he kept going because stopping was not something he was built to do. He also had a specific response to the two words his family said he never allowed in the house: can't and never. Those words were forbidden. That's a very precise detail about a man's character, and it was observed and repeated by people who grew up under his roof. He was not entirely alone, and that matters for the record. There is a version of this story that presents Wendell Scott as a solitary figure against the entire sport, and while the structural picture is accurate, the institutions were against him. Some of the individuals inside those institutions were not. Ned Jarrett, yes. That Ned Jarrett, the two-time Grand National champion and one of the most genuinely respected men in racing, was good to Scott from early in his career and treated him with direct human decency that cost nothing financially and meant something real. Jarrett helped him locate cars and parts and spoke about him with respect when it would have been easier not to. The winning car Scott drove at Jacksonville in December 1963 was a Chevrolet Bel Air he had bought from Ned Jarrett for the season. Richard Petty and his crew chief Dale Inman had a habit of quietly leaving tires and parts, and on at least one occasion, a complete engine somewhere Scott could find them without it looking like a handout. Petty said about Scott plainly to me, when Wendell showed up, it was just another driver. What I admired about Wendell as much as anything was that he was a family man. The Wood brothers, Leonard Wood specifically, let Scott go through their used parts and would mix in new pieces where they could manage it without drawing attention. These were not NASCAR programs. Nobody in the France organization directed any of it. These were individual men making individual choices to help someone they knew could drive. And these choices kept Scott in the sport during years when the margin between racing and parking the car for good was exactly that thin. Bill France Sr. at some point early in Scott's career sat down with him and made a promise. Face to face with a handshake, France told Scott that NASCAR would never treat him with prejudice. The handshake came with extra cash to cover a fuel payment that had been shorted. One of the routine small indignities Scott lived with, and Scott accepted both. France did not keep the promise. The biographer Brian Donovan, who wrote the most thorough account of Scott's life, makes the case that France's posture towards Scott was calculated. France was publicly friendly with Alabama Governor George Wallace, whose politics don't need elaboration here. Giving Scott a license was something France could point to as evidence that the sport was open. Actually leveling the playing field financially or institutionally was something France never did. The automakers, through back channels, gave Scott just enough used equipment to stay in the field. And this is documented, but never enough to compete at the front consistently. It was tolerance calibrated to keep him visible without letting him win. The design, as best the research shows, was exactly that. Despite all of it, Scott was building something real through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. He was accumulating starts and top 10 finishes and a reputation among the men who understood racing that this man could drive. Junior Johnson, the man from Wilkes County who built a dynasty and who won more races than nearly anyone, said of Scott flat out that man could drive. That was the highest coin in this world, and Scott had it. By 1963, he had been competing at the Grand National level for roughly a decade. He had not won a race. He had come close enough that the people watching knew what he was capable of, but he was always fighting equipment that was deliberately kept a step behind the competition, and a sanctioning body that was not going to give him anything he didn't take himself. He had established himself as a hard competitor who drove conservatively enough to avoid the trouble that hostile white drivers sometimes tried to put him in, and mechanically sharp enough to keep cars running that had no business running. He was in his early 40s, and he was still going, and in 1963, he had one of his better cars, the Chevrolet Bel Air from Ned Jarrett, under him for the season. The Jacksonville 200 was scheduled for December 1st, 1963. Under NASCAR's split-season calendar at that time, races in the fall and early winter counted toward the following year's points. So this was technically the third race of the 1964 Grand National season, even though it was being held in December of '63. Speedway Park was a half-mile dirt oval on the west side of Jacksonville, Florida, and it was a real race. The winner would take $1,000 in prize money, and the trophy and whatever came with standing in victory lane. It was worth the trip. December 1st, 1963 in Jacksonville was cold, unseasonably cold for North Florida, temperatures in the 40s, and Speedway Park was the kind of track that had no mercy for a car that wasn't set up right. The surface was rough and rutted from use, and the fastest way around it on a given night depended on reading what the dirt was doing and putting the car where the grip was, and if you guessed wrong on setup, you were going to be slow no matter how hard you drove. Scott arrived having towed from Danville, which is a 9-hour drive, and the car still needed work when he got there, and there wasn't time or money to do all of it. So he did what engineers with money and engineers without money both do when they're under pressure. He made a decision based on what he knew. He pulled one of the 2 shock absorbers from each corner of the car. Running a single shock at each wheel instead of double would make the suspension softer and more compliant on the rough surface. The car would move with the track instead of fighting it. And on a track like this, on a night like this, that was the right call. As he put it himself, the track was so rough, but that way, single shocked was just perfect. I lapped the field. He said that looking back. At the start, he was 15th. The field that night was not a soft one. Buck Baker was there. Yes, that Buck Baker, the back-to-back Grand National champion of 1956 and 1957, with 46 career wins and one of the most experienced and decorated drivers in the history of the sport at that point. Richard Petty was there, still in the early part of what would become the most decorated career in stock car racing history, but already a legitimate threat every time he strapped in. Ned Jarrett was there. Joe Weatherly was there. David Pearson was there. About 5,000 people were in the stands on a cold December Sunday. And the Jacksonville 200 was a real race with real money and real reputations on the line. Wendell Scott started 15th in a year-old Chevrolet on recap tires with a shock absorber setup no engineer would have prescribed on paper, and he went to work. 200 laps on a half-mile dirt track is a long time. It's a long time to manage a car and manage tires and make the continuous small decisions about where to put the car on the surface and when to push it and when to let it breathe. Scott understood this game better than almost anyone out there. He ran conservatively in the early laps the way he almost always did, staying out of trouble and letting the race sort itself out. And his shock absorber gamble was paying off. The car was tracking through the rough spots in a way that a lot of the other cars were not, and he was moving through the field. Richard Petty's car started giving him trouble somewhere in the middle of the race. When your engine is going off, or your chassis is fighting you on a rutted dirt track, all the natural talent in the world only gets you so far. Scott caught Petty with about 25 laps remaining, and passed him and kept going. And by the time the final laps were running out, he had put 2 full laps between himself and second place. He led 27 laps total. When he crossed the finish line, he had completed 202 laps. Buck Baker had completed 200. On the track in real time on that December night, Wendell Scott had won the Jacksonville 200. What happened next is the part I want you to hold on to. Nobody waved the checkered flag at Wendell Scott. He kept driving. He completed extra laps not because he wanted to put on a show, but because no one told him to stop. And he didn't know why. In the infield and in the scoring area, there was confusion, and NASCAR in 1963 ran its race scoring on pencil and paper with one assigned scorer per car and on a rough short-track dirt race with multiple cars running within laps of each other. Scoring errors were not impossible. But what happened next was not a passive clerical delay. Buck Baker was brought into victory lane. He accepted the trophy. The beauty queen kissed him. The flashbulbs went off. The announcement was made to the grandstands. Buck Baker had won the Jacksonville 200. The 5,000 people in the stands accepted this and began making their way to the exits. Wendell Scott was in the pits. He protested immediately. He knew what his scorer had recorded, and he knew that the announced result was wrong, and he said so. Willie Carter, another driver who was there that night and witnessed it, told the Florida Times-Union in 2010 that he recalled Scott going to Baker and telling him directly, "Mr. Buck, you can kiss that beauty queen, but that trophy's mine. I won that race." The officials went back to the scoring records, and what they found after 2 to 3 hours of going through the paperwork was that Scott's scorer had recorded 2 laps that the announced total had not credited to him. When those laps were counted, Scott had 202 to Baker's 200. Wendell Scott had won the race by 2 full laps. The crowd was gone. The beauty queen was gone. The press corps had largely cleared out. The Associated Press had already filed a story reporting Buck Baker as the winner of the Jacksonville 200. Baker had taken the trophy and left for North Carolina. Scott was credited with the win and given the first-place check for $1,000 plus $150 in tire money, which, as he noted later, I really didn't have good years, I had recaps. The formal announcement of the correction was made to whoever was still left in the building, and that was essentially the end of it for that night. Scott said later, everybody in the place knew I had won the race. But the promoters and NASCAR officials didn't want me out there kissing any beauty queens or accepting any awards. That is Scott's own account of what he believed happened, and it is the account his family has consistently supported, and the one that most serious historians of the sport who have examined this story have come to agree with. The official NASCAR position was and remained a clerical error in the scoring. Driver Willie Carter, who was there, told the Florida Times-Union that he believed the delay was an honest mistake, born of the chaos of race conditions on a rough short-track night. I want to be straight about the fact that 2 versions of this story exist. The Carter version is a legitimate, honest scoring error in the confusion of race night. The Scott family version is that the promoters and officials deliberately did not want a black man in victory lane with a white beauty queen in Jacksonville, Florida, in December of 1963 and engineered the delay until the moment had passed. What is not disputed by either version is the outcome. A black man drove the fastest race on that track that night, and someone else got the trophy and the moment and the records. About a month later at a race in Savannah, Scott was given the winner's purse retroactively and a substitute trophy. The family later described the substitute trophy as junk, cheap, and completely inadequate as acknowledgement of what he had earned on that night. The original trophy was never returned. Buddy Baker, Buck's son, and himself a future NASCAR Hall of Famer, said about the incident in 2010 that in the early days, our sport had stuff like that going on, I guess, which is a remarkably gentle way to say something that had no gentle version. Scott put it as plainly as it can be put. It looked like it would have been my biggest thrill when I won the race in Jacksonville, but for a while it wasn't a thrill because it was 2 or 3 hours later before I was declared the winner. I had passed Buck Baker 3 times, and I knew I had won. He knew the whole time. He had driven 202 laps on a cold December night on a rutted half-mile Florida dirt track in a family-built car on recap tires with homemade shock absorber geometry. And he had beaten the 1956 and 1957 Grand National champion by 2 full laps, and he was standing in the pits while someone else got his moment. He went home to Danville and he kept racing. There was no dramatic public protest and no retirement speech and no campaign. He had a family and a mortgage and a race car and a garage, and the sport was what it was. And he was not built to quit. He had 7 children to put through school and a wife who drove the transport truck without complaint and sons who were already building engines alongside him. And he was going to keep going. He told his family around this time, "I may not be with you at the time, but someday I'll get that trophy. Just because I might lose the race doesn't mean I'm defeated. That is worth sitting with for a second." The man knew what had been taken from him, and he expected to get it back, and he held on to that expectation the way you hold on to something you know to be true, even when no evidence exists yet that the world will agree with you. Through the mid-1960s, his equipment actually improved modestly through the same quiet back-channel network that had always sustained him. Ned Jarrett helped him access Holman Moody Fords at prices that weren't real prices. A year-old car for almost nothing in 1964, and later, a 1968 Holman Moody Ford Torino that had been David Pearson's championship car sold to Scott for $1 on Ford's quiet instruction. These were better tools than he had previously had access to, and he used them well. His 1969 season was one of the best of his career in terms of prize money. The International Motorsports Hall of Fame puts his earnings that year at $47,451, though Encyclopedia Virginia gives a lower figure closer to $27,500. And I flagged that discrepancy in the research because both are cited numbers, and I can't reconcile them from the sources I found. Either number represents the most productive single season of his career financially. He was pushing 50 years old. He had been competing at the highest level of American stock car racing for more than 15 years. He was still winning enough respect from the men who knew the sport to keep going and still operating on a fraction of the resources of any team with a real sponsor, and still doing it with his family as his crew. His sons had grown up building race engines and working in the pits, and his wife had driven the truck to more racetracks than most racing wives ever see. And the whole enterprise was a family one in the truest sense. On May 6, 1973, Wendell Scott was entered in the Winston 500 at Alabama International Motor Speedway, Talladega, which at that time was the fastest closed course track in the world. He was 51 years old and still competing at the top level of the sport. On either the 9th or 10th lap, a driver named Ramos Stott blew his engine on the backstretch, and oil and dust went across the track simultaneously, and a massive multi-car wreck unfolded. 21 cars were collected. Some accounts say more. Scott's car was in the middle of it. He suffered a fractured pelvis broken in multiple places, a fractured leg, injuries to both knees, 3 cracked ribs, a laceration to his arm that required 60 stitches. He was covered in blood when the emergency crews got to him. He was transported to the hospital, and it was a long time before the picture of his recovery became clear. He eventually walked, and he made one more start, Charlotte, later that year, where he finished 12th. But the Talladega crash was effectively the end of his driving career. And when it was over and he was convalescing in Danville, the sport he had given everything to for more than 20 years gave almost nothing back. Richard Petty sent him $500. Scott later said the gesture reduced him to tears. Nobody else in NASCAR sent him anything, not a dollar. The man who had shown up every week for 2 decades with his family as his crew, and his recap tires and his secondhand cars, and who had won a race that the sport had spent a decade pretending was a scoring error, was left to recover on whatever he had managed to save and whatever his garage could generate going forward. He said nobody else in NASCAR gave him a dime. He wasn't making an accusation. He was just saying what happened. He went back to Danville and he went back to working on cars. The income from the garage and from racing appearances over the years had been enough to put his children through college, and they had built lives, and he was proud of that. His son, Wendell Jr., had made 3 starts of his own in NASCAR's secondary series in 1973, in the same number 34. The best finish was 13th at Hickory Motor Speedway. The racing life had touched the whole family in ways that ran deeper than the sport had ever acknowledged. In 1977, Warner Brothers released a film about Scott's life called Greased Lightning. Richard Pryor played Wendell Scott, yes, that Richard Pryor, and the film also starred Pam Grier as Mary Scott and Beau Bridges and Cleveland Little. It grossed more than $16 million at the box office. Scott consulted on the film and helped with the driving sequences, but he reportedly got very little money from the deal. The film simplified his story considerably. The racism depicted in Greased Lightning was tame compared to what he actually lived through. And his son Frank said exactly that. And the on-track ending Hollywood gave him was more triumphant than anything he actually experienced. The pattern of other people profiting from what he had built while he got a fraction of what was fair held true even there. He kept working on cars and making occasional public appearances. The 1982 interview in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, where he called himself the greatest moonshine runner of them all, gives you a feel for how he talked about his own life, with self-awareness and a kind of humor and no apparent bitterness, even about things that would have embittered nearly anyone. His son Frank said 2 words were never allowed in the Scott household: can't and never. He meant it as a statement about his father's character, but it reads just as clearly as a statement about his father's survival strategy, because a man who allows himself to believe in can't and never would have quit long before 1973. Scott's health declined in his later years. Spinal cancer took him on December 23, 1990. He was 69 years old. He was buried in Danville's Cunningham Cemetery. He had competed in 495 Grand National and Cup Series races across a career that spanned more than 2 decades. He had 1 official victory, Jacksonville, December 1st, 1963. He had been denied the moment when it happened and the trophy he earned, and he died without having received either one in full. The International Motorsports Hall of Fame inducted him posthumously in 1999. The Virginia Sports Hall of Fame followed in 2000. At neither ceremony did anyone give him the thing that had been taken from him on that December night in Florida. The people who carried Wendell Scott's story forward were his children and grandchildren, and they were specific about what they wanted. Frank Scott, who had worked his father's pit crew as a teenager and had grown up under the roof where can't and never were forbidden words, became the most consistent voice in pushing for formal recognition from the sport. Warwick Scott, Frank's son, and Wendell's grandson founded the Wendell Scott Foundation in 2010 to preserve and expand the legacy. That same year, 2010, 47 years after the Jacksonville 200, the Jacksonville Stock Car Racing Hall of Fame did something that NASCAR had not done. A group of local racing historians and enthusiasts, led by a man named Ronnie Blair, had a replica trophy built, a replica of what Scott should have received on the night of December 1st, 1963, and presented it to the family at Golden Isle Speedway in Brunswick, Georgia. It was not the original trophy. It was not a NASCAR ceremony. No one from the sanctioning body was there in an official capacity, but it was something. Frank Scott stood there and said, "We can tell our father he got his trophy. It wasn't enough," and the family said so plainly, without drama. Frank told AutoWeek in 2020, "We'd like for NASCAR to have an official ceremony for maybe 10 minutes. That would make it right. 10 minutes? After 47 years. That was the ask. In 2015, NASCAR inducted Wendell Scott into its Hall of Fame. 25 years after his death and 52 years after the Jacksonville race, and the induction was long overdue. By any measure, anyone wants to apply to it. Wendell Jr. spoke at the ceremony. It took extreme tenacity and a lot of forgiveness on a lot of people's parts to get where we are today. He was right about that in every direction the sentence can be read. The Hall of Fame placed Scott in the permanent company of the sport's greatest figures, which is exactly where he belonged. It did not address specifically what had happened on the night of December 1st, 1963. There was still no official ceremony and still no trophy, and the specific wrong that had been done to him on that specific night still had no formal acknowledgement from the sport itself. Before we get to 2021, there is something worth noting about Bubba Wallace because it connects directly to Scott's place in history. On October 4th, 2021, Bubba Wallace won the Yellowwood 500 at Talladega, the same track where Scott had been nearly killed in 1973 in a rain-shortened race. He was driving for 23XY Racing, co-owned by Michael Jordan. It was his 143rd Cup Series start. In doing so, Wallace became the second African-American driver to win a race at NASCAR's top level. The first and only one before him had been Wendell Scott, 58 years earlier. The sport had produced exactly 2 black race winners across its entire history up to that point. 2. In more than 70 years of competition. The weight of that number doesn't require any editorial commentary. It speaks clearly enough on its own. On August 28, 2021, one day before what would have been Wendell Scott's 100th birthday, NASCAR President Steve Phelps walked onto a stage at Daytona International Speedway before the Coke Zero Sugar 400, and he stood with Frank Scott and a dozen members of the Scott family and Bubba Wallace. And he presented a custom-built trophy to the family. I want to say clearly what this was and what it was not, because the details matter. Wendell Scott has been the official winner of record of the Jacksonville 200 for decades. His 202 laps were credited on the night of the race after the scoring review, and he was the official winner. The 2021 ceremony was not a correction of the record. It was a commemorative trophy, a formal acknowledgement by NASCAR as an institution that what had happened in 1963 was wrong, and that this family deserved a real trophy from the sport itself rather than a replica from a local Hall of Fame. Prize money was not retroactively paid beyond the original $1,000. This was a moment of recognition, not a full accounting, and I think being honest about that distinction matters. But Frank Scott was there, and Warwick Scott was there. And when Warwick took the trophy into his hands, he kissed it, the way the beauty queen had kissed Buck Baker in the Jacksonville Winners' Circle 58 years before. NASCAR's Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, Brandon Thompson, said it is certainly one of the most iconic and monumental moments in American stock car racing history. Frank Scott said it matters because my father earned it. He always wanted to get his trophy, and he predicted that he would get his trophy one day. He said, "I may not be here with you all, but one day I'll get my trophy." The man had been right. It had just taken 58 years. Wendell Scott spent the better part of 40 years proving himself to a sport that had decided before he arrived what his ceiling was going to be. He raced on recap tires because Goodyear wouldn't give him what they gave everyone else. He rebuilt wrecked cars in his own garage because no sponsor would put their name on his door. He carried a loaded revolver to southern racetracks because the threats against him were real, and going there unarmed was not a reasonable option. He drove his own transport truck and used his own family as his crew, and accepted whatever quiet kindnesses the individual men around him were willing to extend, and he turned all of it into a 20-year Cup Series career with 495 starts and one official win, and enough top 10 and top 20 finishes to make the argument that with comparable equipment, the number next to his name might have looked very different. The win at Jacksonville was real. It was documented and official the night it happened, and it has been on the books ever since. What was absent for 58 years was the recognition that goes with winning, the trophy and the moment and the sport standing up and saying plainly that a black man from Danville, Virginia, had driven the fastest race on that track that night and had been denied what he earned, and that the denial was wrong. The 2021 ceremony gave the family those things. Not the money, and not retroactive equality, and not a full accounting of what a different version of American racing might have looked like if the institutions had been different, but the trophy and the moment and the acknowledgement that he had been right all along. His kids went to college. His son ran the same number. His grandson built a foundation in his name. A Hollywood studio made a movie, and Richard Pryor played him. 4 different halls of fame eventually inducted him. And 58 years after he drove 202 laps on a cold December night in Jacksonville, Florida, while someone else stood in his victory lane, his son held a trophy at Daytona and kissed it in front of the cameras and in front of the sport that had spent a very long time pretending it didn't owe him one. Wendell Scott told his family he was going to get that trophy. He didn't know when, and he didn't live to see it, but he knew it was coming because he knew what he had built was real, and what he had won was real. And the record said so, and the record doesn't go away. He had that kind of faith. Not in the sport that had tried to contain him, but in the thing he had built inside it that could not be taken back, no matter how long the trophy stayed in someone else's hands. He got it, 58 years late. But he got it.